Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is,
Natasha Piano.
well, thanks so much for being with us. Now, you've got a lovely backdrop that looks as though it's real, as opposed to what you see in some Zoom calls. My backdrop is not real, it's a photograph I took. Yours looks as though it might actually be there. Is that right?
That's right. This is real. We're in real time.
And you look like you're a tea person.
I don't discriminate between coffee and tea. See, so I'm both. I'm both.
But I see. Yes, I can see a coffee machine there. But what saw more prominently before was a teapot and teacups and what looked like some tins of tea. But it's nice to have both forms of caffeine given equal time.
Yes, exactly. I definitely enjoy both at different times of the day. So I'm a chronic sipper.
A chronic sipper. I wanted to begin by asking you something that I pose as a set of queries to all my guests. Namely, what's currently dynamizing, impeding, preoccupying, interesting you.
Well, I am currently moving, so that is both dynamizing and impeding me. Dynamizing in that I get to change locations and start a new chapter in a new space, but impeding my other research in some senses. So I'm so happy to be here today to talk to you about what I love to talk about.
Now, are you moving cities, jobs, neighborhoods?
I am moving homes, not cities. It's all in the same city, in the same job, but I am physically moving my
Right, right.
material possessions as we speak. Someone is moving them. Or at least beginning the process of moving them. And luckily, I'll be able to maintain some continuity with my job and office. That's why you see I will be inhabiting this space as I collect myself and my belongings and transport them. So it's like
Wow.
I'm lucky to have a permanent office.
Yes, that makes a big difference. And there are lots of books in it, which means you're not having to pack and unpack all those books. So there may be many others. I don't know.
It or not, there are many others which are going to somehow find their way into this office, perhaps at the expense of the tea and the coffee. But yes, there are others at home which will be slowly making their way into this office. And so that's both dynamizing and impeding
Yes,
and hitting some senses
absolutely. And my
disorienting
experience of it is that it's always worse than you think, or worse than I think in expectation, but that unpacking is slightly less traumatic than the packing.
uh,
Um, but it also takes me a couple of months before I really know where I want everything to go.
I am also traumatized by the packing, which is why I am delighted to be here with you. Evade some of that, and my family members are helping. And yes, I am traumatized by the packing, but I do love the unpacking because I actually enjoy the process of putting everything in a new place. And perhaps I spend more time on that than I should, but I indulge. I indulge because I want to make up for the trauma that I experience while I pack and cull, and I often also just throw away so much prematurely, and then I unpack and realize that might have aggressively given into the culling instinct. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes this time around.
Now, we're here to talk about your research. Because I live in the global south and I work in the global south, we just don't have access to a lot of work published in English, especially books, but also articles. Libraries just can't afford them. So I have to start by saying I've not read your book that came out last year, Democratic Elitism, the Founding Myth of American Political Science. So I'm going to be possibly in the same situation as a lot of listeners, but I have read a vast amount of elite theory over the years. All your boyfriends, Mosca, Pareto, etc. Gentile, I don't know if he's one of your boyfriends, but these dead men from the early 20th century who were so important. So I wondered if you could, and Schumpeter, who I guess is one of your other guys, right? But
He's my first love. Yeah.
your first love, and we never forget them, do we? They're always there. Everybody gets compared to them, perhaps
Yeah.
unfavorably. But let's get on to Schumpeter in a moment. Let's talk about the elite theorists who may
Sure.
not be so well known to some listeners, and what happened in their translation and transliteration and take up in US political science.
Great. Well, yeah, it's a funny story. Um, my book is ostensibly about democratic elitism, which is a tradition that's generally understood to equate democracy primarily with the presence of free and fair election, and it sees elections as this main institutional mechanism that allows for popular participation while actively containing it in a way that's conducive to large modern mass polities. And the conventional wisdom is that my boyfriends, this idea originated with my boyfriends, the so-called Italian school of elitism, which is comprised of Vilfredo Pareto, Mosca, and also Robert Michels. And the standard story goes something like this. The elitist fascist Italians sought to constrain mass participation through electoral processes. And then in the post-war period, proceduralist minimalists from Joseph Schumpeter to Richard Posner and Adam Jaworski took some of the Italian findings to render elections the necessary but insufficient condition for democratic practice. And then in response, realists suggested that competitive elections is the only measurable criterion we have to work with. So it's through this supposed lineage that we landed on the contemporary popular definition of democracy as free and fair election, or at least some elections as some helpful proxy to distinguish ourselves from authoritarian regime types. Now, I challenge this narrative. I think my book basically turns this story inside out. The Italians, I say, they weren't elitist theorists of democracy. They were democratic theorists of elitism. And they investigated elite power not to endorse it as the ideal, but to expose how liberal institutions and electoral procedures can enhance elite domination of the majority and fail to secure popular interest. So they did so as democratic theorists because they thought that democratic measures enhance the quality of leadership and the stability of the state. And they were pointing to the plutocratic threats residing within elections, not to idealize them, not to celebrate them, not because of an anti-mass anxiety, but really as some kind of to correct a semantic confusion that they thought was creeping in with the equation of election and democracy.
Some of the bad press or the misleading press they get is because they wrote in the period running up to and were in some cases political participants in a particular moment in Italian history, namely fascism. And this is a time when, retrospectively, including very soon after the war, the idea was you were always on the left or always on the right in that struggle. But in fact, lots of people shifted.
Mm-hmm.
One thinks of Croce as an example, moving around, Mosca moving around, and in other places, François Mitterrand in France, for instance, who was a far rightist who became a leftist and was in the Maquis. So it's not as easy as it might appear to catalog people, but it also seems to me that regardless of any shifts they may have gone through, regardless of the historical conjuncture in which they wrote, they didn't have much of a chance for being read in the way that you would like, apart from Pareto, because neoclassical economists love him.
Yeah.
And his idea is not about elites continue to be enormously important in any Economics 1000 textbook in the United States. But I wanted to ask you about the thing that I always thought they were most afraid of, which was plutocracy.
That's right. I mean, I couldn't agree more. The book tries to recover their critique of the plutocratic threats that lie within electoral institutions, and specifically the ways in which these plutocratic threats, if not contained or mitigated, can easily turn into what Pareto called demagogic plutocracy. Um, and the alliances between demagoguery and plutocracy, once mass electorates become disillusioned with the equation of election and democracy that seems to promise some kind of fulfillment of popular sovereignty, which it can never deliver. I mean, if you think about the time period you alluded to, the post-Risorgimento, so basically we're talking about 1870 to 1923, it was well known that whether you were on the left or right, plutocracy and parliamentary plutocracy, particularly on the Italian peninsula, was the enemy. It was laughable because, especially the egregious case of Italian politics, where everyone knew how trasformismo, or this kind of historical transformism, was generating a plutocratic parliamentary regime that hollowed out any kind of pretense for democratic or liberal procedural institutions. And so, I mean, all of these thinkers really were afraid or thinking about how to contain plutocratic elements of electoral governments. They certainly, in my view, weren't expressing some kind of pervasive anxiety about mass politics. If anything, they were critical of elites. They were afraid that elites weren't genuine or a story. They weren't competently ruling in the face of the plutocratic threats that actually they were contributing. They were contributing to.
So, what does happen in their uptake by US political scientists?
This is actually my favorite topic. I've um, Part of the motivation of the book was to actually detail how it came to be the case that Pareto and Mosca were then conceived of as these fascist elitist figures, when in reality, especially when you compare them to the whole swath of figures in the period, including Robert Michels, they were the least fascistic and most clairvoyant prophets, I'd say, of the dangers of identifying democracy with election. Many different things happen, and I don't think you can blame any group. I think that the American political science contributed to this as much as Italian political science did in the post-war period. I mean, we can take each figure in turn. Pareto was a misanthrope, I guess, in you could call him that. He certainly had no kind words for the masses or the elites, and he had what uh, what many call a pessimistic view of human nature. He didn't believe in any such thing as human rationality, and in fact, he believed that humans are inherently irrational, and this kind of grated against a lot of the Enlightenment confidence of that period, where people believed in these progressive narratives of a dialectical history moving forward to emancipate human freedom and this forward progressive march. And Pareto, he just would have none of that. And so there was this vitriolic kind of rhetoric that he espoused, made him an easy target, so to speak, for everyone who wanted to believe more in the age of democratic possibility, especially in Italian politics at the time. So already from the start, Pareto was handicapped because of his kind of his misanthropic tone. But I think in that he was warning, and there was an angry warning for elites that they better be careful lest they become susceptible to the very plutocratic trap that electoral regimes engender. That he wanted them to be more open to the idea that they needed to chain themselves in order to preserve their power through democratic mechanisms. Right from the start, he's just an unpopular figure because of his orientation and his tone. but he died in before Mussolini's march to power. There are a few, and so we really can't tell how things would have gone, but I think that it's pretty clear to me that he wasn't necessarily condoning a fascist regime of any type. Instead, he offered it as, some kind of warning or I told you so to the parliamentary politicians that he thought were ushering in a new stage of demagogic plutocracy by essentially not curtailing their own power. Um, so we really don't know what would have happened with Pareto. But the telling thing is that it was easiest to use him, especially since Mussolini identified him as one of his inspirations, though Mussolini did that with a host of other figures who, we don't necessarily include in the fascistic lineage. But leaving that aside, it was easy since he died in before the March on Rome, so you can't really say where his politics
where
would
he
have
would have
gone.
been. Isn't,
Right.
just before we get on to the other boyfriends,
Sorry. I get a lot excited about both, so
no,
it's
and
hard.
so you should. I want you to talk more about him before we go on to Gaetano and Robert and all the rest of it. One factor I'm guessing in terms of the uptake in Gringolandia after the war is that really most of his sociological writings have never been translated into English. It's a vast corpus of work. It's available in Italian. Bits of it had always been there in English, but not that much actually. I wonder if that's part of the problem.
Part of it, yeah, absolutely. Though I think that it would have happened regardless. I mean, the translation story is interesting in and of itself. Um, well, uh, so it's a little bit complicated, but the way that the Parisian Orfra was translated in the war ended up in the hands of many post-war liberals who sought to, um, I think, let's say, um, how shall I put this? Make Pareto's writings more accessible to a liberal audience, and so part of that is certainly key to the story, though I think that's more the case with Gaetano Mosca than it is with Pareto. I also think Pareto's writings are hard because there's such a methodological mix in his sociological writings that it's almost impossible for any translator to be conversant in economic sociology and political theory in the way that Pareto indeed was, and he uses mixed models in his sociological writings all the time. He uses economic modeling all the time. So it's not the easiest translation task. But, I still think that there are other reasons that, I mean, translation's always a problem, right? Translation's always a problem with any figure in the history of political thought. But how Pareto and Mosca's thought was then received in the post-war period is so different than any of their contemporaries that there are more variables that track onto the story. Um, yeah, so I think it was a perfect mix, or there's just constellation of variables where we have Pareto who dies before the March on Rome, so you can't really tell where his writings are going. He's a mixed methodological thinker, and that makes it difficult to um, to translate. It makes it difficult because he's being translated, 30 or 40 years after he's writing the tratado, so it's distinct. It's a distinct translation task. What else happens? I mean, his wife becomes in charge of the estate, and there are complicated legal battles about how it should be translated and who should be translating it. And yeah, so that's part of it. But then when you turn to Mosca, Mosca didn't die before the March on Rome, and in fact, he was always a critic of parliamentary plutocracy on the peninsula. And in fact, he was always considered the more conservative thinker of the pair. But when you think about it, it's wild to think about Mosca's legacy on this front because he Croce and Mosca were equally were shared a political all the same shared political prescriptions and critiques of plutocratic parliamentarism. And at the same time, they also almost immediately um, denounced Mussolini's regime. Mosca resigned from the Senate in response to Mussolini's ascent to power. He and Croce together wrote the anti-fascist manifesto and wrote it together and signed it. And yet, for a variety of reasons, Mosca came to be remembered as the conservative who warmed to liberalism after Mussolini's ascent to power, and Croce became the face of the resistance and the Italian intellectual liberal left, which is wildly strange. It's a strange story. Why is that the case? There's ostensibly nothing that they did differently. I mean, Mosca didn't really warm to liberalism, even in his resignation speech. He said, I have always denounced the parliamentary plutocracy that led to these problems. And I could have, he also kind of offers an I told you so moment. He says it is ironic that he is giving the funeral oration for an Italian parliamentarism, given that he offered those critics. But he says, I've never changed my mind. I'm just lamenting that we weren't able to preserve the political and social goods that liberalism can indeed offer. And so it's just so interesting that Mosca became this boogeyman or proto-authoritarian fascist figure when Croce, Einaudi, Luigi Einaudi, who's the first president of the Italian Republic, they all got out scot-free, even though they all probably shared the same kind of critique of Italian plutocratic parliamentarism. I think that it was easy for Einaudi and Croce to put blame on Mosca and Pareto because he was dead by then, Mosca because he represented some kind of, democratically liberal side of the Senate, but still conservative, and that he was a defender of liberal institutions. But so was Croce. So it doesn't really it doesn't really add up. But I think it was easy for Italian political scientists to distance themselves from fascism by scapegoating the so-called Italian elitists. And that further lubricated American political science's ability to do so.
One of my professors in college moved to the Vatican after the war to study and asked to meet fascists.
Mm-hmm.
And there weren't any. There were none in the Vatican. There were none in Rome. There were none he could encounter anywhere in Italy. It was, in fact, impossible to meet people who had ever been fascists.
Oh yeah,
So
how convenient.
very convenient, somewhat
Convenient.
improbable, shall we say. But
Sure.
an interesting experience as a young man wanting to meet the other. I mean, he was a socialist, but he was a priest, and so he was prepared to hear confession.
Right.
But folks obviously found some means of defining themselves against a recent past, accurately or not, in terms of their own affiliations and conduct. And one way of doing that is to identify leading figures whom you do not wish to be associated with. Was that
Absolutely.
maybe part of the process?
Absolutely. I think that's right. I mean, there's two things to be considered. First is that fascism is a movement that was born at the end of the 19th century. And so it changed from it being a fascist in 1890. It was wildly different than what it meant in 1923. Just in 30 years, the movement kind of was appropriated. In my view, it was appropriated from the Sicilian fasci to generate a different kind of movement altogether. And it took a minute for people to calibrate where they stood in that process. So that's the first problem with the term fascism, is that it changed, or it's from its inception to even at 30 years later, it completely changed. And so that always poses a problem in historiography. So and I think that happened certainly with Pareto, Mosca, Croce, Einaudi, and the whole boot of early 19th century Italian political and economic theorists. And then And then, of course, it's much easier to say, oh, I'm not a fascist ex post facto, especially in Italy, which found itself, you know, which has always found itself with wildly different, regional divisions that
Yeah.
transcend Italian identity, even. And I think it became easier to identify as an anti-fascist because of an opposition to certain figures that no one would contest their fascism. Nobody was going to defend Mosca or, well, Pareto, as you said, the neoclassicists in American and Anglophone social sciences certainly defended Pareto, but in a qualified way, and perhaps by attributing to him positions that he would have also scorned. Um, so, so I think that happens all the time. But it wasn't enough just to have to just say Gentile is the fascist. It was easier, I think, to attribute the proto-authoritarian instincts to the Italian school of elitism. But I think there's another wrinkle here, and that is that Robert Michels did indeed become a card-carrying fascist, committed throughout his life. He died in 1936. But I think it isn't really in my book. I argue that he is the first corrupter of the Italian school of elitism, not the inheritor of it. I think he never really belonged in the lineage in the first place, not just because he was a naturalized Italian, he's a German, but because he had different methodological commitments and different political commitments. So he is the only fascist thinker of the three members of the Italian school of elitism. And yet, ironically, he became regarded as the most democratically recuperable thinker in the post-war period. So American and Anglophone scholarship decided that his theory of competition was the most democratically viable as opposed to the authoritarian instincts of Pareto and Mosca, even though he was the only one who became fascist, and he was far more indebted to his Doctor of Author, Max Weber, than the influence of Mosca and Pareto. I mean, Pareto barely influenced him. He had already gone kind of senile by the time that Michels met him, and Mosca, although he was initially interested in his work, distanced himself from Michels because they had different political and methodological commitments. So I think it's ironic that he became this democratic emblem, despite the fact that he started off as a socialist and very quickly became a fascist who kind of popularized a lot of Weberian concepts in fascistic intellectual circles. Um, yeah, it's odd, and I think we should start to divorce Michels from the other two thinkers.
Now, in terms of the arguments about majoritarianism, one problem is that, and I think you've touched on this in some of your writings that I have managed to see, the idea that voting is democracy seems very limiting when you think about all the other pillars of democracy that are meant to sometimes ensure the interests of elites, but sometimes ensure the competition of different interest groups, sometimes are there to make sure that there is a rule of law that can continue, that people can have faith in. You know, when the Democratic Party basically betrayed the working class in the United States in the 1960s and on, the courts became one area where the working class could, get some sort of purchase. That's until the Republican Party tried to destroy that.
Mhm.
So, aren't there other institutions that are very important that continue? Museums, universities, the courts, the bourgeois media, with a relative autonomy from majoritarianism that are crucial to democracy.
I think that's right. I think that my aim in recovering Pareto and Mosca's insights is that um, on the one hand, we know that democracy means far more than electoral politics or voting or ballot boxes. We know it, and we talk about that, and we talk about the plethora of institutions that make up a democratizing wave or a democratizing moment. And so we know it. And yet at the same time, we also, for a variety of reasons, like the the specificity of being able to define democracy as free and fair election, or we want to do that too because we think it's helpful or useful. And Mosca and Pareto told us it's not just wrong, but it's going to actually generate expectations that neither democracy or liberal institutions can deliver. So instead of worrying about how stupid the people are, that is, how they probably don't want to vote, or don't there's apathy and voter turnout, or that people don't actually want care about politics, instead of worrying about voter apathy, it's not the question really isn't how stupid are the people, it's how stupid do you think they are? Do you think that an equation of an election and democracy will really be fulfilling or satisfying when it isn't really satisfying to us on some kind of subconscious level. And so they were warning against that, not just for semantic reasons, but because they thought that there were real political dangers that would result from this convenient conflation of election and democracy. Um, Primarily that we would forget the value of institutions that aren't necessarily going to generate majoritarian results that include the rule of law, legitimate opposition, uh, to, sure, plenty of other institutions and practices, the media, the bourgeois media, plenty of institutions and practices that they say deserve their own labels, their own names. And while there's some kind of synergy between democratic majoritarian institutions and liberal ones that secure individual rights, or what others in the 19th century called like guarding against the tyranny of the majority, they thought that the people could handle the semantic distinction between liberal practices, procedures, norms, and institutions, and democratic ones. They thought that that was just a viable distinction that everyone could intuitively accept. And the definition of democracy as fair and free election confounded, so to speak. It was problematic on a variety of levels. Now, that doesn't mean that liberalism and democracy can't go together, so to speak, or that there can't be democratizing consequences of certain liberal institutions. But for their part, they thought that it was cleaner, easier, more practical to defend liberal democracy, or this iteration of popular government called liberal democracy, by identifying democratic institutions as majoritarian, popular, and anti-plutocratic norms and practices and procedures, and liberal institutions, which promulgated the rule of law, sanctity of the courts, judicial review, a host of other practices and procedures we like, but for reasons beyond the fact that they are democratic. I mean, they didn't think they were democratic, right? But they thought that we could handle the separation. And in fact, that separation would enable us to defend elections, rule of law, legitimate opposition, the media and what have you, and democratic institutions on their own terms in a way that would make both democracy and liberalism cool, you know, or valuable, or something that we desire, as opposed to some hollow category that we barely believe in.
Let's get on to the first love. Have you packed him up? Is he en route to the new home, or is he sequestered in your office where you are now?
No, I mean he's my first love. I actually um I am I wrote a long time ago, I wrote a monograph on him that I tabled because I don't know if I wasn't ready or the world wasn't ready. I'm not sure which, but I am working on a monograph on Schumpeter called Schumpeter's Dare. Um, he is a part of this story, obviously, the story of democratic elitism, elite theory. And in a certain sense, I think that, as I wrote in this book, I mean, there's a chapter on Schumpeter, and I talked about how he kind of radicalized the Italian or dared, let's put it this way, he dared American and Anglophone scholarship to identify democracy and election despite his reservations. And I think it worked, the joke was on us though. But I'm working on a manuscript now that's more about Schumpeter's, let's say, it's a single author manuscript about his work and capitalism, socialism, democracy, specifically his thinking on capitalism and socialism and the kind of economist he is, and rehabilitating what I call Schumpeterian economics against some kind of just defense of unregulated market competition, which I don't think he was a proponent of. And so it's the focus of that book is a little bit more economically oriented than, but obviously the political implications of understanding capitalism in a Marxist register, I think are, I think we're ready for that in the 21st century. So that's what I'm working on.
One of the ways in which the big man is invoked by some of your rivals for his affections is under the rubric of creative destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And this is sometimes used to say, aha, capitalism works if there's a terrible crisis where the working class loses its shirt and big corporations survive because of state participation. That's all wrong. What we should allow is for the big organizations to fall apart, and then something new and advantageous will emerge. Or it's to say that markets eventually return to equilibrium. So, the argument will be that when the boom in investment and borrowing associated with creating data centers crashes into failure, that's a good thing. That's not a waste of resources, right? And you get this with people's history of the bicycle, of the railway, of freeways, of electronics, everything. And of course, the big moment when the big man comes into play is the dot-com bust, which is supposed to show the value of creative destruction, that eventually you get this equilibrium, right? Can you comment a bit on that, perhaps slightly mad adumbration?
Yeah, so that's wrong. That's not what he said. A lot of post-war political scientists, not just post-war, Clay Christensen is the most famous. He was at Harvard Business School for a long time, and he popularized this glorification of creative disruption that's supposed to be part of Schumpeter's legacy. But Schumpeter coined the term, well, he didn't actually invent the term creative destruction, but he popularized the term creative destruction. And what Schumpeter was worried about was not the creative part of capitalism. He was worried about the destructive part. And specifically, he was worried that capitalism undermines its own structures, values, and systems such that it is always on the verge of destroying itself. And its proponents' belief in the system itself. That he is actually worried, and especially when he was writing Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, we tend to think of him as an anti-Cold War thinker, and that is certainly not the case. He's writing in this book in 1939. In fact, he wrote most of it before the Soviet Union's, in Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. So he's not worried about Soviet communism. He is worried about authoritarian authoritarianism, whether that's in a Hitlerite variety or a Stalinist variety. Okay, so he is concerned that capitalism will only help undermine itself, especially when compared to state-centric authoritarian regimes who will undermine all of the features of liberalism that he holds dear. And so he is daring liberal elites to understand or try to come up with a more coherent defense of liberal values than the ones that they currently espouse. Now, part of that entails regulating this destructive capitalist machine that destroys everything in its path, including capitalism and liberalism, which is really the concern he has. I mean, he doesn't know that he thinks we're going to lose when he's writing Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. He thinks we're going to lose the war. He thinks that the West is going to lose the war. And at that point, he was right to right to think that. So this anachronistic idea that he's out to sing the virtues of capitalism in order to offer some, Cold War defense of such institutions is just wrong. It's not really reflective of the environment in which he's operating. He is worried about an authoritarian threat to liberal capitalism, and he thinks that capitalism itself is such a destructive agent that it will initiate its own destructive, lest its wings are clipped. That's his expression. Unless what he calls plausible capitalism is implemented, and that necessarily entails smoothing out the destructive elements of the cycle, which is what he proposes in the first part of Capitalism and Socialism and Democracy. So he's certainly no Austrian economist, Austrian school economist like Hayek. He doesn't believe in unregulated markets. He believes that competition is neither fair nor free, so it's necessarily monopolistic, and that's how it's designed to be, unless it's externally handicapped in some sense because of economies of scale. It's just that's what so he's a Marxist thinker in that way. He's against the neoclassical economists and the marginalists. He doesn't believe in a circular flow theory. He believes that producers generate demand, not consumers. And that's why he sides with the socialists in the socialist calculation debate. He sides with Pareto and Enrico Barone about this. So just that idea that the way that Schumpeter has been used is so uh, well, it's just inappropriate to what his economic and political theory it posits. So the book is really trying to correct that, not because, he's a Marxist thinker. He's a Marxian economist. He's not a Marxist thinker, and he really compels us to stop pitting capitalism as a market economy against socialism, a planned economy. He actually tries to convince us about the merits of thinking about how it is that these two systems can go together and the ways in which competition is inclement in both capitalist and socialist organizations.
So you're at the party, everybody's in their finery. There are
Oh
many
yeah.
good-looking men and women. In walks Joseph. Why did he suddenly capture your heart?
Like, oh, he's so funny. He's so funny. Um, for somebody who is said to be one of the founders of the empirical a behavioralist revolution in political science, one who eschews prescriptive ideals and instead focuses on how things are as opposed to how things should be. I think he bucks that divide in every page of Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy. He is so he's so brilliant. At demonstrating how the empirical and the normative are intertwined and in the reader's hands, so to speak. I think that with humor and charm, he is able to generate a state of self-reflection in his readers, those who read his books in their entirety as opposed to just one small part, the fourth part of a 5-volume tome. He really asks us to be honest about our commitments and normatively fight for the ones that we have deemed worthy. And I think that not only is that one of the parts or the roles of the vocation of the social scientist, so to speak, but it's just ironic because he is known or he is remembered as someone who seems to eschew prescription in political theorizing. And I can't imagine, I can imagine him smirking at that label because he also just understood the precise shade of positivism that pervaded the mind of his moment. And so he was able to speak in that register. I don't know if it induced, felicitous effects. I don't know if it induced the kind of self-reflection that maybe he had hoped. In fact, I know he was dismayed by his little volume success, by the success of Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, because he felt as though his audience didn't understand it. Everyone asked him, "Oh, what do you expect us to do? What do you want us to do?" And he said, I can't tell you what to do, you know. You have to do it. You have to go fight for what it is that you believe in. And if you think that my call is fatalistic, what normal man would, you know, refuse to keep rowing the boat even if the ship is sinking? That's what he said. And I think that that admonition is wildly applicable to us today. If we are to reread his text, it's still it's still highly relevant.
Speaking of applications to today, Prof, getting back to the issue of plutocracy, some folks refer to this moment, this conjuncture in the United States as another Gilded Age. And it's clear there's been a monumental redistribution of income upwards in
Yeah.
the US over the last 50 years, and it's completely bipartisan in terms of political parties. Are there things that one can take from the guys we've been talking about to understand the political economic situation in the US today?
Yes and no, because I fear that, as they said in their own moment, they worried it was already too late. Um, you know, let's take Pareto, he's born in 1848 and he starts railing against the bipartisan, plutocratic dimensions of parliamentary politics. I mean, that's why he's so scathing to both sets of elites. He said, there's no difference in these elites. They're obviously colluding through competition, through recombinatory powers that electoralism entails. It's called collusion, and you don't need an explicit conspiracy or design in order for that to happen. That's just generally how it's going to work for a variety of structural reasons. There's not no sanctimonious moralizing about who's at fault. It's the structure element of the parliamentary electoral game. And so in the 1870s, 80s, he is calling for reform. And then by the 1910s, he thinks that they're the Italian peninsula has reached its tipping point vis-a-vis the ability to curtail plutocracy, um, when once it will be the whole entire parliamentary system will be challenged by a demagogic plutocrat. And it's important to understand that this plutocrat is, this demagogue is going to be a plutocrat himself. He is going to be a product of the plutocratic elite, and yet be able to never say that was never really one of them, in undoing the social and political goods that parliamentary politics can offer. So in some sense, I worry. I started writing this book. I wrote it in 2016, like 2014 to 2016. And I, and now when people, I thought that I thought that things could happen because, I thought it was, I don't know, I thought that there was some kind of hope that parliamentary or representative institutions might understand that curtailing their own power is the only way to save the whole system itself. I don't know in 2026 whether I am whether I am entitled to such optimism. Um, uh, in some sense, I wrote this book detailing how their pessimistic posture included a critique of elites. But on the other hand, maybe it was the most optimistic posture imaginable to think that a critique of elites would ever engender the kind of self-reform necessary to protect liberal institutions. I'm not going to say it's not possible, but I worry that the historical rejection or trajectory isn't necessarily repeating itself. Nothing perfectly repeats itself, but there are patterns. And so I'd be I'd be I wouldn't want to allow myself any more optimism have already than I have already inhabited.
Now, this would be the moment when I'll ask you what's on the docket next, but
I already told you.
you've already told us. So to bring things to a close, Prof, can I inquire as to whether there's anything you'd like to add? That could take the form of going over terrain we've at least partially traversed, or it might be something entirely new that we haven't discussed.
Well, I will say that in my effort to revive Italian elite theory, in contradistinction to the Italian school of elitism. So I still think there's hermeneutic value in reviving the approach that Pareto and Mosca offered us. It's not the only way to do social science. It's not the only way to think about the world, but they offered it as a heuristic in that was premised on the idea that it's really hard to talk about who rules us. We love to loathe those who rule us, right? And so that lends itself to a sanctimonious moralizing that they hoped their elite theory heuristic could not eliminate, but contain. And so there are different elements to the approach that they espouse, dividing every society between leaders and led as the primary existential fact of political life, always insisting upon an empirical and historical orientation to the study of elites, lest we become susceptible to thinking that we are in a more tragic position than any other society or a more optimistic, hopeful place than any other society. This wild hubristic presentism. There's just certain elements of the approach. And I think that most of all, they were guarding against the moralism imbued in any kind of elite theory that says these people are the problem, or the people are the problem, or no, the elites are the problem, or no, it's this set of elites, not me. I'm not. I'm perfect, and it's these kinds of elites, the tech elites that they're the worst. No, it's the intellectual elites. They tried to make sure that we guarded against that in any self-honest reflection of our current state of affairs, and I always think that's timely, no matter which geopolitical situation we are confronted by.
Well, thanks so much for that, for being generous with your time and your ideas.
Thank you for having me.